Have you ever had this strange feeling that you're capable of more? Not in a motivational way, but in a quiet, unsettling way. Like somewhere deep down, you know you're powerful. But when it's time to act, speak up, or choose differently, that power feels distant, muted, almost forgotten. You watch yourself settle for less. You overthink decisions you once would have trusted yourself to make. You shrink your desires so they feel realistic. And part of you keeps wondering, when did I become like this? Here's what's wild. You didn't lose your power. It wasn't taken from you. And it didn't disappear over time. It was slowly trained out of your awareness. Not by one big failure, but by repetition, by conditioning, by learning what feels safe instead of what feels true. And the most dangerous part, this forgetting feels normal. So what's really happening here? Here's the thing. This forgetting doesn't happen all at once. It happens quietly. At first, it looks harmless. You hesitate instead of acting. You second-guess instead of trusting. You tell yourself you'll do it later, when you're more confident, more prepared, more certain. But later keeps moving. And slowly, a pattern forms. You start noticing that you don't respond to life the way you used to. Decisions feel heavier. Risks feel bigger. Your voice feels softer inside your own head. You choose what's familiar over what's aligned, not because it's right, but because it feels safer. And this shows up everywhere. In relationships, you tolerate things you once promised yourself you wouldn't. In goals, you lower the bar so failure hurts less. In daily life, you operate on autopilot, reacting instead of choosing. What makes this confusing is that nothing looks wrong on the surface. You're functioning. You're surviving. You're doing what's expected. But internally, there's a dull pressure, like something essential isn't being used anymore. Most people assume this means they've lost confidence, discipline, or motivation. That's not it. What's actually happening is that your mind has learned a very specific lesson. Power creates uncertainty, and uncertainty feels unsafe. So your system adapts. It prioritizes predictability over possibility, approval over authenticity, comfort over agency. And because this adaptation happens gradually, it feels like you are the problem, not the conditioning. That's why this pattern is so common and so invisible. You don't wake up one day powerless. You wake up one day realizing you've been living as if you are. And that's the real problem, not a lack of strength, but a learned forgetting of how much choice you actually have. So the real question becomes, how did your mind learn to associate power with risk in the first place? Okay, so here's what's actually going on beneath the surface. Your brain isn't designed to make you powerful. It's designed to keep you safe. From an evolutionary perspective, power meant risk. Risk meant uncertainty. And uncertainty meant danger. So your nervous system evolved to favor what's familiar over what's possible. That's not a flaw, it's survival intelligence. But here's where the modern problem starts. Your brain doesn't distinguish between physical danger and psychological discomfort. Being rejected, judged, failing publicly, disappointing someone, or stepping outside your identity all trigger the same survival circuitry as real threat. So every time you spoke up and were shut down, every time you tried and failed, every time expressing yourself cost you approval, your subconscious took notes. Not consciously, emotionally. This is how power starts getting associated with pain. Over time, your mind learns a shortcut. Don't initiate. Don't stand out. Don't choose boldly. Not because you can't, but because your system remembers the cost. This is where subconscious programming comes in. Your subconscious runs on patterns, not logic. It doesn't care what you want. It cares what feels familiar and emotionally predictable. So if asserting yourself once led to conflict, if trusting yourself once led to embarrassment, if choosing differently once led to instability, your mind quietly files power under handle with caution. Now layer in habits. Neural pathways strengthen through repetition. The more often you hesitate, the more hesitation becomes automatic. The more often you defer, the more deferring feels natural. Power doesn't disappear, it just stops being accessed. Think of it like a light switch in a room you stopped using. The switch still works. You've just trained yourself to live in the dark. This is where the reticular activating system, RAS, plays a massive role. The RAS is your brain's filter. It decides what you notice and what you ignore. When you forget your power, your RAS stops highlighting opportunities for agency. It starts highlighting reasons not to act, risks over rewards, obstacles over options. Not because those are more real, but because they match your internal focus. Here's what's wild. The moment your attention shifts, your experience shifts. When you believe you have limited control, your mind proves it. When you expect resistance, your RAS finds it everywhere. This is why power feels gone, even when it isn't. Now let's talk about identity. Your brain protects identity more fiercely than happiness. If you've unconsciously identified as the responsible one, the agreeable one, the realistic one, the one who doesn't rock the boat, then power threatens that identity. And the mind will always choose identity over expansion, unless awareness interrupts it. This is where the mystical language often enters. People talk about losing energy or low vibration, but psychologically, what they're describing is attention collapse. When your attention fragments across fear, comparison, and expectation, your sense of agency drops. Energy isn't mystical force here, it's mental and emotional availability. When you're present, aligned, and intentional, power feels natural. When you're scattered, reactive, and self-monitoring, power feels distant. And here's the key insight. Power isn't something you generate. It's something that emerges when awareness replaces autopilot. This is where the observer effect becomes relevant, not as physics, but as psychology. The moment you observe a pattern, it weakens. The moment you notice autopilot, choice returns. That's why remembering power can happen instantly. Not because something new appears, but because something unconscious becomes conscious. And once that happens, forgetting stops being automatic. Now here's where it gets interesting. Because understanding how you forgot your power is only half the story. The deeper question is, where exactly does this forgetting show up in your real life, and how does it quietly shape your choices every day? That's what we're going to unpack next. Now here's where things get really clear, and a little uncomfortable. Because forgetting your power isn't abstract. It doesn't live in philosophy or theory. It lives in specific moments where you hesitate, shrink, or choose familiarity over truth. Let's slow this down and look at how this forgetting actually operates across different layers of your mind, and how it plays out in real life. The two-layer system, conscious versus subconscious power. On the surface, your conscious mind wants change. It wants confidence. It wants clarity. It wants momentum. It wants to feel in control of its own life again. But underneath that desire is a subconscious system that asks a very different question. Is this familiar, or is this risky? And here's the key tension. Your conscious mind is future-oriented. Your subconscious is past-oriented. The conscious mind imagines possibility. The subconscious remembers consequences. So when you try to step into your power, these two layers often clash. You consciously think, I should speak up. I should go for this. I should stop tolerating this. But subconsciously, your system remembers. Last time this hurt. Last time this caused instability. Last time this changed how people saw me. That internal conflict creates friction. And friction feels like procrastination, anxiety, self-doubt, exhaustion, overthinking. Not because you're weak, but because two systems are pulling in opposite directions. This is how power gets stalled. Real-life example number 1. Relationships. Let's say you're in a relationship, romantic, professional, or personal, where something feels off. You know you're being misunderstood, undervalued, or slowly minimized. Consciously, you recognize it. Subconsciously, you feel the discomfort. But instead of addressing it, you soften your needs. Explain things away. Delay the conversation. Tell yourself it's not that bad. Why? Because somewhere in your emotional memory, asserting yourself once led to conflict, loss, or rejection. Your mind learned. Power threatens connection. So it protects connection at the expense of truth. Over time, this creates resentment. Resentment drains energy. And drained energy feels like lost power. But nothing was lost. It was redirected toward survival. Real-life example number 2. Career and purpose. You feel capable of more. You sense you're underusing yourself. You know your work doesn't reflect your full potential. But when opportunities appear, something stops you. You delay applying. You talk yourself out of visibility. You wait for permission, clarity, or confidence that never arrives. This isn't laziness. This is identity protection. If you've identified as the stable one, the safe one, or the realistic one, then stepping into greater power threatens that identity. Your subconscious asks, what if success changes me? What if I fail publicly? What if I outgrow people? So instead of expanding, your system chooses consistency. Not because it's better, but because it's predictable. Real-life example number 3. Self-trust and decision-making. One of the clearest signs of forgotten power is decision paralysis. You research. You ask for opinions. You wait for signs. You keep circling. Not because the decision is impossible, but because you've outsourced authority. Somewhere along the way, you learn to trust. External validation over internal clarity. Experts over intuition. Consensus over conviction. So power doesn't feel like yours anymore. It feels conditional. But here's the truth. Your intuition isn't mystical. It's your subconscious processing information faster than conscious thought. When you stop trusting it, you stop trusting yourself. And self-trust is the foundation of power. Why power feels heavy when you try to use it. Here's something most people don't realize. When you've been operating on autopilot for a long time, conscious choice feels exhausting at first. Power requires presence. Presence requires attention. Attention requires energy. Autopilot is efficient. Awareness is effortful, until it becomes familiar. This is why stepping into power can feel uncomfortable, awkward, or even scary. Not because it's wrong, but because it's new. Your nervous system is recalibrating. The mystical layer, grounded in psychology. This is where people often describe things in spiritual terms. Low energy, blocked chakra, misalignment. But psychologically, what's happening is this. Your emotional state and attention determine how much agency you experience. When your attention is fragmented, pulled into fear, comparison, regret, or anticipation, power collapses. When your attention is grounded, present, intentional, and self-directed, power emerges. Energy, in this sense, is coherence. And coherence is what allows action to feel effortless. This is why remembering your power can feel like an internal click. Not because something magical arrived, but because your attention finally aligned with your intention. Why this forgetting persists? The reason forgetting feels permanent is because it's reinforced daily. Habits, routines, social expectations, emotional memory, constant distraction. All of these keep attention outward, and power always begins inward. But here's the most important realization of this section. Forgetting your power is reversible, and it doesn't require becoming someone new. It requires becoming present again. Once awareness enters the system, autopilot weakens. And once autopilot weakens, choice returns. Which leads to the most practical question of all. If this is how power is forgotten, what does this mean for how you live, relate, choose, and move forward every single day? That's exactly what we're going to unpack next. Now we move into the part that quietly determines the direction of your entire life. Because forgetting your power isn't philosophical. It isn't abstract. And it definitely isn't harmless. It directly shapes how you live, choose, relate, tolerate, and move forward every single day. And once you really understand this, you realize something most people never do. Your life is not limited by circumstances. It is limited by how much power you allow yourself to remember. Let's break this down carefully. 1. Forgetting your power shows up in the smallest daily moments. Most people think power shows up in big, dramatic decisions. It doesn't. Power shows up in micro moments. Moments like speaking up when your voice tightens, saying no when it would be easier to say yes, choosing discomfort instead of familiarity, trusting your inner signal instead of outside opinions. When you've forgotten your power, these moments feel heavy. So instead, you delay, rationalize, minimize, compromise with yourself. You tell yourself, it's not a big deal. I'll deal with it later. I don't want to overreact. But here's what your subconscious learns in those moments. My inner signals aren't worth acting on. And once that belief forms, power doesn't disappear. It simply goes unused. You start living reactively instead of deliberately. Life feels like something you manage instead of something you shape. 2. Why forgetting your power feels normal and dangerous. This is important. Forgetting your power doesn't feel alarming. It feels normal. Because it's reinforced everywhere. You're rewarded for being agreeable, being flexible, being low maintenance, being realistic. And slowly, power starts to feel like a liability. Your nervous system learns. Standing out costs energy. Taking ownership risks rejection. Choosing differently creates instability. So you adapt. You shrink your desires. You soften your opinions. You manage expectations. Not because you're weak, but because you're conditioned. And that conditioning is why forgetting your power feels invisible. 3. How this destroys self-trust over time. Here's one of the most damaging consequences of forgetting your power. You stop trusting yourself. Not consciously, subtly. You hesitate before making decisions. You second-guess your instincts. You look for reassurance everywhere. You start outsourcing authority to other people's opinions, experts, trends, signs, timing, the right moment. But power is self-trust. And when self-trust erodes, confidence follows. Not because you lack ability, but because you've trained yourself to doubt your own signal. This is why even capable people feel stuck. 4. How forgetting power shows up in relationships. This is where the impact becomes unavoidable. Relationships activate your deepest survival wiring. When you've forgotten your power, relationships start running on fear-based rules. Don't be too honest. Don't make things uncomfortable. Don't risk abandonment. Don't be misunderstood. So you tolerate misalignment. Explain yourself endlessly. Avoid hard conversations. Manage other people's emotions. And here's the cost most people miss. Every time you silence your truth to preserve connection, your system registers self-betrayal. That self-betrayal accumulates. It becomes resentment, exhaustion, emotional numbness, loss of attraction, quiet anger. You don't lose power in relationships because of the other person. You lose it because you stop anchoring yourself internally. Power in relationships is not dominance. It's self-presence. 5. How this affects your goals, drive, and motivation. Let's clear something up. Most people don't lack motivation. They lack alignment. When you've forgotten your power, your goals are often shaped by comparison, fear of falling behind, approval seeking, identity compensation. So your system resists. This resistance shows up as procrastination, burnout, constant doubt, starting strong, quitting quietly. People call this laziness. It's not. It's your subconscious asking, is this really ours? Is this meaningful or performative? Is this expansion or escape? Power returns the moment your goals feel internally true, not externally impressive. 6. The big aha. Power is not force, it's attention. This is the realization that changes everything. Power is not willpower. It is attention. Where your attention goes, your power follows. When attention is scattered across fear, regret, anticipation, comparison, self-monitoring, your sense of agency collapses. But when attention becomes present, grounded, intentional, self-directed, power emerges effortlessly. This is why presence feels empowering. This is why clarity feels stabilizing. This is why awareness dissolves confusion. You don't create power. You stop leaking it. 7. Why remembering your power feels uncomfortable at first. Here's something people aren't warned about. When you start remembering your power, it doesn't feel peaceful at first. It feels confronting. Because awareness removes excuses. You start seeing where you stayed silent, where you settled, where you avoided responsibility, where you chose comfort over truth. That awareness can feel heavy, but that heaviness isn't punishment. It's integration. Your nervous system is recalibrating. Autopilot is efficient. Presence requires energy until it becomes familiar. This discomfort is temporary. The clarity it brings is permanent. 8. How remembering power changes your identity. When power is forgotten, identity sounds like, I cope, I survive, I deal with things. When power is remembered, identity shifts to, I choose, I respond, I participate. This shift changes how you speak, how you move, how you decide, how you tolerate, how you commit. You stop asking, what should I do so this doesn't go wrong? And start asking, what aligns with who I am becoming? That question reorganizes your entire life. 9. Why power compounds over time. This is what most people never realize. Power compounds. Each time you honor an instinct, choose alignment, act despite uncertainty, speak a truth gently but firmly, your system learns. We are safe in our agency. And once your nervous system trusts power, it stops resisting it. Confidence stops feeling forced. Decisions stop feeling heavy. Life stops feeling reactive. Not because problems disappear, but because you're present inside them. The core realization of this section. You don't need to become more powerful. You need to stop forgetting yourself. Forgetting isn't a flaw. It's conditioning. And once you see that clearly, power stops feeling mystical. It becomes practical, daily, usable. Which brings us to the most important part of all. How do you consciously remember your power, without forcing, pretending, or becoming someone you're not? That's exactly what we're moving into next. Now comes the most important part, because insight without application just turns into another moment of awareness that fades. This is where remembering your power stops being an idea, and starts becoming a practice. And here's the key thing to understand before we begin. You don't activate power. You remove what's blocking it. These shifts aren't about becoming louder, tougher, or more dominant. They're about restoring inner authority, quietly, consistently, and honestly. Let's break this down into 4 practical shifts you can start using immediately. 1. The attention reclaim practice. Find where your power leaks. Power leaks through attention first. So the first step isn't action, it's observation. For 1 week, simply notice where your attention goes when you feel small. What thoughts repeat when you hesitate? Which situations drain you instantly? Ask yourself, what am I focusing on right now that makes me feel less capable? You'll start noticing patterns, replaying past mistakes, anticipating negative reactions, imagining rejection before it happens, scanning for approval. None of this is wrong. It's just unconscious. The moment you notice the pattern, you interrupt it. Awareness is not passive, it's corrective. And here's what's wild. The second attention returns to the present moment, power follows automatically. 2. The identity interruption shift. Catch the autopilot story. Every time you forget your power, there's a story attached to it. Stories like, "That's just how I am. I'm not the type of person who does that. I don't want to cause problems. It's safer this way." These aren't truths. They're identity habits. So the practice is simple but powerful. When you notice hesitation, ask, "Is this who I am, or who I've been trained to be?" That question alone creates space. Because identity is not fixed, it's rehearsed. And every time you interrupt an old identity story, you weaken its grip. You don't need a new identity yet. You just need to stop automatically obeying the old one. 3. The emotional calibration method. Fear versus truth. This is one of the most important distinctions you'll ever learn. Most people confuse fear with intuition, but they feel very different in the body. Fear feels contracting, tight chest, shallow breath, urgent thinking. Truth feels expanding, even when it's uncomfortable. There's tension, yes, but also clarity, relief, direction. So when you're unsure, pause and ask, does this choice shrink me or expand me? Not, is this scary? But, does this move me toward myself or away from myself? Your body already knows the answer. This is how you rebuild self-trust. Not by forcing confidence, but by listening accurately. 4. The conscious choice practice. Small acts, consistently. Power doesn't return in one dramatic moment. It returns through small, deliberate choices. Choose to speak one truth you'd normally soften. To take one action you've been delaying. To say no once where you'd usually comply. To act before certainty arrives. These don't need to be loud. They need to be honest. Each time you do this, your nervous system learns. We are safe when we choose. And once that trust forms, resistance drops. This is how power becomes natural again. What you'll notice when this starts working. When you apply these shifts, Three things happen surprisingly fast. First, your mind gets quieter, because it no longer needs to argue with itself. Second, decisions become easier, not because life is simpler, but because you're clearer. Third, people respond differently to you, not because you changed them, but because you changed your internal posture. You'll feel more grounded, more present, more yourself. That's power returning. Why this works, the real reason. Because these practices move power from the subconscious back into consciousness. And once something becomes conscious, it stops controlling you automatically. This is the psychological version of the observer effect. Awareness collapses hesitation into choice. Presence collapses fear into clarity. You don't need more motivation. You don't need more information. You need more ownership of your attention. And once that happens, remembering your power stops being something you try to do. It becomes something you are again. Which brings us to the final piece. How to integrate this understanding and carry it forward without slipping back into forgetting. That's where we close this journey. So let's bring everything together. Throughout this video, we've been talking about something that feels deeply personal. That quiet sense that you once felt more powerful, more clear, more connected to yourself. And somehow, over time, that feeling faded. But here's the truth you've hopefully felt by now. You didn't lose your power. You didn't break it. And you don't need to become powerful again. You simply learned, very gradually, to forget it. You learned to prioritize safety over truth. Familiarity over expansion. Approval over self-trust. And none of that makes you weak. It makes you human. What changes everything is awareness. The moment you understand that power isn't force, control, or confidence, but presence, attention, and inner authority, the entire story shifts. Power returns when you stop abandoning your own signals. When you listen instead of override. When you choose alignment over autopilot. And real talk, this isn't about becoming fearless. It's about realizing that fear doesn't get to run your life anymore. Because once you're aware, forgetting is no longer unconscious. And remembering becomes a choice. So here's the question I want you to sit with. Where in your life have you been shrinking, not because you can't handle more, but because you stopped trusting yourself? If something in this video resonated, if a moment, a pattern, or a decision came to mind, drop a comment and share what stood out to you. Your reflection might be exactly what someone else needs to hear. And if you want more deep dives into psychology, consciousness, and the hidden mechanics behind how the mind actually works, subscribe to Echoes Between Worlds. We're here to explore what happens when awareness returns, and what becomes possible when you finally stop forgetting who you are.